We got company.
Broadsword calling Danny boy.
You have my sympathies.
We do not follow maps to buried treasure, and X never, ever marks the spot.
I'm glad it's you.
Well, I understand double O's have a very short life expectancy, so your mistake will be short-lived.
Would you like some refreshments?
Oh, I'm fine. Thank
Enjoy the show.
Hi there, welcome to Sitting Through the Credits, a film review podcast covering new releases, cult classics, and everything in between. My name is Matt, and for this 6th episode, I'll be covering another favourite film of mine, the 2013 Formula One film, Rush. Rush was directed by Ron Howard from a script written by Peter Morgan and is focused upon the sporting rivalry between racing drivers Niki Lauda and James Hunt, leading up to and throughout the 1976 Formula One season. I'm a huge motorsport and Formula One fan, and I clearly remember the motorsport community's excitement when this film was announced. In fact, it's quite shocking that this year marks the film's 10th anniversary. If you're well acquainted with F1 history, you'll know that it is an almost impossible task to fit the entire story of the 1976 season into the runtime of a single film, let alone to cover the dramatic battle between Scuderia Ferrari and McLaren, James and Niki's journeys to Formula One, as well as some of their personal dramas beyond the racetrack in a little over 2 hours.
What kind of person does a job like this? Not normal men for sure. Rebels, lunatics, dreamers.
Shot over 61 days in Austria, Germany and the UK on a $38 million budget, Ron Howard shot Rush like an independent picture, using its budget in the most targeted and effective way possible. His goal was to put the audience in the cockpit of these machines, whilst ensuring a safe and respectful atmosphere on set. The visceral realism of Rush's racing sequences, married to the human drama and authenticity of the recreated 1970s time period, makes this easily my favourite film of his resume. Living in Vienna and having been introduced to Niki Lauda through his wife, scriptwriter Peter Morgan approached Niki for his input on Rush. This led to weekly meetings and many discussions about the reality of F1 racing. Sharing the script with Ron Howard, with whom he had worked on Frost Nixon, Ron was quickly hooked by the story, despite knowing little about Formula One at the time. It was Peter who nominated Daniel Brühl to play Niki on screen, having asked Niki's friends to suggest potential actors who could take on the role of the distinctive F1 star. Daniel and the real Niki were in frequent contact throughout the production to ensure that the portrayal of the character was as close as possible to the man himself.
My name is Niki Lauda, and racing people know me for 2 things. The first is my rivalry with him.
In the search for an actor to play James Hunt, Ron Howard began discussions with Chris Hemsworth's agent, and 36 hours after that first conversation, Chris put together an audition piece on his own volition and was swiftly accepted for the role.
My name is James Hunt. My father is a stockbroker, my sister is a barrister, and my brother is an accountant. And I do this.
Studio work for the film took place at Longcross Studios in Surrey, with additional footage shot at real-world locations including Easton Neston House, the real family seat of Lord Hesketh. The most critical locations to get right for this film were obviously the racing circuits. However, many of the real-world locations are still in use in motorsport today, and are almost unrecognisable when compared to their 1970s counterparts. Therefore, an alternative approach had to be taken to bring the film's racing sequences to life. Some location footage was shot at the real Nürburgring Nordschleife, but the majority of racing sequences were filmed at British racing circuits. Those circuits were made more difficult to identify through the use of set dressing, the costuming of the extras, digital backdrops, clever editing, and, in some cases, filming the cars being driven around circuits in the opposite direction. Brands Hatch in Kent stood in for circuits including Fiorano, Monza, and Paul Ricard. My local racing circuit, Cadwell Park in Lincolnshire, stood in for circuits including Crystal Palace, Fuji Speedway, the Nürburgring, and Watkins Glen. Donington Park in Leicestershire stands in for Fuji Speedway, and Snetterton stood in for circuits including Fuji, the Nürburgring, and Paul Ricard. In addition to the filming of Formula 3 cars at Cadwell Park, additional Formula 3 footage was shot on the location of the real Crystal Palace circuit, its distinctive Italian terraces easy to spot during their brief appearance in the film. The early collision between Hunt and Lauda takes place after Barn Corner on the pit straight at Cadwell. The disused Blackbush Airport in Hampshire became the backlot for the film, with a modular pit lane and track and an accompanying grandstand constructed on site. The set at Blackbush would be physically dressed and augmented via digital backdrops to stand in for the relevant circuits that it was meant to be portraying. Director of photography Anthony Dodd Mantle was responsible for the film's innovative camera work, with small and remotely operated cameras mounted all over the bodywork of the racing cars, as well as inside cockpits and racing helmets to help create the film's most visceral and energetic racing sequences. Some of these were shot using around 30 different types of cameras on a single filming day. On-track coverage was provided by Pursuit Precision driver Jim Dowdall, who drove a modified Mitsubishi Evo 8 alongside the cars on track. Further on-track coverage was provided by a helicopter and a mule car. The mule car used in Rush was a Formula 3 car which formerly belonged to British touring car driver Rob Austin. Rob initially became involved with the film as his family owned the original Surtees TS19, which was driven by Brett Lunger, and which collided with Lauda's car after Niki and his Ferrari had crashed at the Nürburgring. Rob appears in the film playing Brett, whom he met during the course of filming, and was also involved in putting together 3 working replica Ferrari F1 cars for the production. WDK Motorsport were responsible for producing McLaren and Hesketh replicas, and the 2 BRM replicas were put together by Mirage Engineering. The 2 BRM replicas also featured interchangeable bodywork so that they could double as Ligier, Shadow and March F1 cars where necessary. 9 prop F1 cars were constructed in total, specifically for Rush, and these were run alongside period F1 cars which are still driven in competition today, lending the film an additional level of authenticity.
Ah, what music! They could never have imagined it, those pioneers who invented the automobile, that it would possess us like this in our imaginations, our dreams. I say, men love women. And even more than that, men love cars.
One of the original F1 cars used in the film was a Hesketh 308D that was driven in the actual 1976 German Grand Prix by Guy Edwards. Guy was one of the drivers who assisted in rescuing Lauda from his burning car during the race. Tragically, Sean Edwards, his son, who drove the car in the film, was killed in a high-speed accident in the same year that Rush was released. As well as its 2 well-known leading actors, Rush is notable for having an exceptional supporting cast. Alexandra Maria Lara and Olivia Wilde play the most significant supporting roles as the love interests of Niki and James, Marlena and Susie, although Marlena's is certainly the more dramatic and emotional role of the two. The film's rich cast also includes Christian McKay as Lord Alexander Hesketh, Pier Francesco Favino as Clay Regazzoni, David Calder as BRM proprietor Lewis Stanley, Colin Stinton as McLaren managing director Teddy Mayer, and Stephen Mangan as McLaren team manager Alistair Caldwell. The film does a good job of including some of the sport's big names such as Sterling Moss, as well as some of its lesser known but essential figures such as Anthony Bubbles Horsley and Harvey Doc Postlethwaite. Other well-known actors can be spotted in minor roles in the film, such as James Norton and Natalie Dormer. At one point it was even planned for Russell Crowe to have a cameo as Richard Burton, however the actor playing Burton in the brief glimpse we see of him is uncredited and too blurry to identify. Costume designer Julian Day and fashion and makeup designer Faye Hammond made key contributions to the authenticity of the film, their work ensuring that the film's 1970s timeframe was recreated as accurately as possible. The Hunt-Lauda rivalry can even be seen in the characters' attire, with 2 major fashion houses clothing the characters. Gucci provided the wardrobe for Hunt and Susie, whilst Ferragamo clothed Niki and Marlena. One of my favourite elements of a movie experience is a film's accompanying music soundtrack, and Hans Zimmer's score for Rush is a personal favourite of mine. From James's charismatic hospital entrance to Hesketh's upper-class antics in the pits, and from the horror of Niki being trapped in his burning Ferrari to his epic fight back through the field at Monza, a track shockingly not included on the album, the score mirrors the emotions of its characters perfectly, and for me it ranks amongst Zimmer's best work. The accompanying tracks from Dave Edmunds, Steve Winwood, Mud, Thin Lizzy and David Bowie also all work perfectly to immerse you in the era. So, overwhelming praise from me so far, but from the perspective of a motorsport historian, how accurate is Rush when you compare it to the real duel between Hunt and Lauda? The film opens 10 rounds into the 16-round 1976 Formula One season, with the start of the fateful race at the Nürburgring, a race which would play such a pivotal role in the outcome of the World Championship that year. We then flash back to James encountering Niki at a Formula 3 race at Crystal Palace in 1970. In reality, Niki didn't compete in the 1970 British F3 Championship, and the clash depicted at this specific race took place between Hunt and Dave Morgan. The two crashed out whilst fighting for third place, and once James's Lotus 59 had come to a standstill, now minus 2 wheels, he famously leapt from the cockpit, marched over to Dave and promptly knocked him to the ground. Despite competing against each other on numerous occasions before reaching Formula 1, the only occasion where either driver claimed a Formula 3 victory whilst competing against each other was at Zolder in 1970, James taking the win whilst Niki crashed and retired from the event. The film chooses to skip Lauda's initial foray into F1 with the March team in 1971 and 1972, and instead chooses to start with his time at BRM in 1973. This is understandable from the perspective of telling a parallel narrative, as it was the same year that James first entered F1 with Hesketh. The Watkins Glen crash at the S's, which is depicted in the film, is an amalgamation of the crashes suffered by Francois Sever in 1973 and Helmut Koenig in 1974. The car shown is clearly an Elf-branded Tyrrell, bearing Sever's number 6, whilst the death of the driver is consistent with Helmut's fatal injury, being tragically decapitated when the car slid under an unsecured Armco barrier. Rush loves to create parallels between its two drivers, and often plays a little fast and loose with the real-life chronology of the events. James and Susie Miller's wedding is depicted as though it coincided with Niki signing with Ferrari. However, their wedding took place in October 1974, whilst Niki signed with the Scuderia earlier in autumn 1973. It is interesting to see the parallels and contrasts between both of the drivers' relationships too. Marlena left actor Kurt Jurgens for Lauda, and Susie left Hunt for the actor Richard Burton, both coincidentally actors who voiced the narrator in Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds. Niki quickly established himself at Ferrari, being one of the only drivers who dared to challenge Il Commendatore and his, by definition, perfect cars.
It's terrible. Drives like a pig.
Oh, you can't say that.
Why not? It's a Ferrari. It's a shitbox. It understeers like crazy, and the weight distribution is a disaster. It's amazing. All these facilities, and you make a piece of crap like this.
The exchange in the film where Niki criticises the car did take place at Fiorano in autumn of 1973, but wasn't merely with a mechanic. Piero Lardi, now Piero Ferrari, Enzo's illegitimate son and current vice chairman of the Ferrari Automotive Company, translated for Niki, who didn't speak Italian at the time, but only after he had told Niki numerous times the things that he couldn't say. Enzo gave Niki an ultimatum that once his recommended changes were made, the car had to be a second faster in a week, or he was out. Clearly, elements of this story were lifted for the sequences with Niki at BRM in the film. It's a shame that the one race where we see James racing his Hesketh 308B in 1975 isn't the famous 1975 Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. Not only was this James Hunt's first F1 win, but Hesketh's only win, and it is arguably the greatest underdog victory in Formula 1. Instead, the film shows us an extremely fictional duel between Hunt and Lauda at Watkins Glen, where James suffers a mechanical failure and Niki wins the 1975 World Championship. Although Watkins Glen was the final round of the 1975 season, Lauda had already secured the championship at the previous race at Monza, and his on-track battle was in fact between himself and Emerson Fittipaldi, who brought the car home in second. As for James, he didn't retire from the Grand Prix. Instead, he brought his Hesketh home in P5 for 2 points, which was enough to secure Hesketh a well-earned 4th place in the championship. In addition to being Hesketh Racing's best championship result, 1975 was also notable, as James beat the factory Ferrari driver Clay Regazzoni that year, a major factor in McLaren's decision to sign him for 1976. The fictionalised version of the race depicted in the film does provide a good contrast between Marlena and Susie, however, Marlena supporting Niki from the pit wall, while Susie watches via television as she models in New York. We also get an effective visual metaphor for the breakdown of Susie and James's marriage, as James's engine fails at the very moment that Susie stops watching the broadcast and removes her wedding ring. In addition to his troubles at home, James's Formula 1 dreams were soon to take a disastrous turn.
What are you saying?
I'm saying it's over, superstar. The banks have stepped in, started laying everyone off. Probably have to sell this place.
Although Lord Hesketh did indeed withdraw his financial support from the team, Hesketh Racing continued beyond 1975 under Bubbles Horsley. Hesketh's final race wouldn't occur until the 1978 South African Grand Prix. And so the film moves on to the 1976 Formula One season. Unsurprisingly, this is Rush's key focus, a season still regarded as one of the sport's greatest, encompassing 16 races over 10 months. Beyond the competition between the drivers, a key reason for this season's popularity is the cars themselves. The car with which Ferrari contested the 1976 season was the Ferrari 312 T2, so named because it was the second iteration of Mauro Forghieri's design, sporting a 3-litre flat 12 engine. Developments of the 312T design would help Ferrari achieve 4 Constructors and 3 Drivers' Championships, making it the most successful car design in F1 history. McLaren's challenger for 1976 was the McLaren M23D, the 4th incarnation of the team's well-developed workhorse, powered by a specially tuned version of the legendary 3-litre V8 Ford Cosworth DFV. This engine gave 5 Formula One teams 10 Constructors' Championships, powered 9 drivers to 12 Drivers' Championships, and, outside of F1, powered 2 winning Le Mans cars and 10 Indy 500 winning cars. In its second year in competition, the McLaren M23 was the car that Emerson Fittipaldi had driven to 1974 Drivers' Championship success, as well as being the car with which McLaren secured its first Constructors' Championship. However, claiming 6 of its 16 race wins, James Hunt remains the most successful driver of any McLaren M23 in Formula One. Ferrari were the team to beat in 1976, given that Lauda was the defending champion from 1975, his pairing with the 312T proving to be a potent combination. With that being said, the V8 Ford Cosworth DFV would once again prove its worth across the season, powering McLaren, Tyrrell, March, Penske and Lotus to 10 victories between 5 drivers, whilst the Ferrari Flat 12 would claim 6, 5 wins for Lauda with a single win for Regazzoni. In the pre-season Race of Champions at Brands Hatch, first blood would go to Hunt, the British driver taking the non-championship win, whilst Lauda retired from the race with brake issues. Despite his reputation as Hunt the Shunt, it is undeniable that James had some serious talent behind the wheel, being immediately competitive despite this being his first year with McLaren, and putting his M23D on pole in the very first race at the Autodromo de Interlagos in Brazil. Despite this, Niki would take the first official race win of the season, whilst Hunt crashed out with a sticking throttle. Much more intense than Hunt and Lauda's personal rivalry was the battle that would rage between the two team managers at Ferrari and McLaren, Daniele Audetto and Alistair Caldwell. Unfortunately, this is not extensively covered in the film, but I highly recommend checking out the BBC documentary Hunt vs Lauda, F1's greatest racing rivals, for some fascinating behind-the-scenes stories from the 1976 season. Despite winning the first 2 rounds and coming home in P2 at Long Beach, an off-track incident also not covered by the film would significantly impact Lauda's future performances that year. Whilst at home moving a mound of earth with a tractor, Niki inadvertently tipped the vehicle over and became pinned beneath it, breaking 2 of his ribs in the process. Going into the next round, the Spanish Grand Prix at the Circuito Permanente del Jarama, Hunt knew that halfway through the race Niki's driving would be impacted by the pain from his ribs and he'd be able to pass him with ease, which is exactly what happened. Although not covering Niki's injury, Rush does depict the scrutineering battle which took place immediately after the race, even if it does imply that Niki was the one responsible for inciting McLaren's disqualification for a car width rule which had only come into force the day before the race.
It's too wide. Disqualified. What? You're disqualified. How can we be disqualified? 1.5 seconds.
This type of scrutineering debacle was unheard of at the time, with the majority of F1 teams in the 1970s operating with a much more lax approach to the technical regulations than we see in the modern day iteration of the sport. It was Alistair Caldwell's belief that the issue with the McLaren's width had been spotted by scrutineers ahead of the event, but that this information was deliberately kept quiet until Ferrari were in a position to use it to their advantage. As a result of James's disqualification, Hunt's points were given to Lauda. Despite the political war being waged between their two teams and the depiction of their rivalry in Rush, in reality Niki and James actively steered clear of the political side of the sport, their love of racing being a common bond which united them. Niki would often visit McLaren's pits and wouldn't hesitate to have a drink with James, who he considered to be a nice guy. The pair had even shared a flat during their Formula 3 days. As the film mentions, relocating the M23D's oil coolers further back to make it legal did make the car handle dreadfully. At Zolder, despite a strong qualifying, Hunt struggled to hold on to second place and was forced to resort to aggressive driving against Jacques Lafitte's Ligier in an attempt to hold on to his position. The dramatic computer-generated crash depicted at this race in the film is entirely fictitious, however. The real reason for the car's retirement was a problematic gearbox, which seized up on lap 35, leaving James with no alternative but to park the car. As a motorsport fan, I have to highlight the famous six-wheel Tyrrell P34, which is a great machine to see on screen. That being said, it's a shame that the film doesn't cover its sole victory that year at the Scandinavian Raceway Anderstorp in Sweden, one of only 4 races not won by Ferrari and McLaren that year. Another of the film's race sequences which received less coverage than I was hoping for was the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch. The film does include a recreation of the famous shot of James following Niki into Druid's Corner before the view was obscured by trees, James emerging from the other side in the lead. This event took place after the race was famously restarted, however. The events which occurred before this were some of the most dramatic of the year. On lap 1 of the Grand Prix, both Ferraris collided on their way into Paddock Hill Bend, with Hunt's McLaren also damaged when it was lifted up onto 2 wheels after making contact with the spinning Regazzoni's rear tyre. Rather than completing the first lap, because of the damage, James used an escape road to return to the pits. Although he had deemed the car a write-off, the McLaren mechanics determined that the damage could in fact be repaired. It was at this time that the British crowd of 80,000 started a slow clap, which turned to boos and then chants of "We want Hunt." The disorder, which included cans and bottles being thrown onto the circuit, gained the mechanics valuable time to restore the McLaren back to running order. With repairs completed, James's M23D was rolled back onto the grid, to the fury of Lauda. James went on to win the race, and Ferrari protested immediately, the FIA only deciding to make Hunt's disqualification official once the British crowd had left the circuit. Unlike Spain, this result would not be overturned later in the season. Some particularly effective visual storytelling is used during Niki and Marlena's honeymoon. As Niki starts to believe that having something to lose might affect his racing, the flames of the fireplace can be seen reflected in the window, foreshadowing the fiery accident that lies in his immediate future. As it was in reality, the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring Nordschleife is the pivotal race of the film. Rush does play fast and loose with some of the Grand Prix's details, however. The nickname attributed to the Nürburgring in the film is the Graveyard, when the real nickname coined by Sir Jackie Stewart was in fact the Green Hell. Similarly, the free practice crash depicted before the race is another invention for the film. The only driver to suffer such a crash was Vittorio Brambilla, who crashed 3 times that weekend but still took part in the race, and the crashed car is clearly not his Orange March. A further detail left out of the film is the legal drama that took place that weekend, when police arrived at the circuit to place a restraining order on the Ram racing team, an action which left the sole female driver, Lella Lombardi, without a drive. Although it is true that Niki led the call to boycott the Nürburgring race on safety grounds and did lose by a single vote, the meeting to do so took place earlier in the spring rather than at the race weekend itself. A particularly fun piece of trivia at the start of the Nürburgring race is that the second McLaren car overtaking Hunt and Lauda for the lead is actually being driven by the real F1 driver Jochen Mass at the real Nürburgring, Jochen having provided technical assistance for the film. The attention to detail put into the recreation of Niki's fateful crash, which saw the driver survive a blaze of over 400 degrees C, must be praised as one of the film's strongest scenes. Understandably, the sequence had to be achieved via digital means, but the detail is still impressive given the film's modest budget. During the crash, it is even possible to see Niki's helmet flying off, a key moment during the accident, which happened because the padding of the helmet was compressed during the impact. The race was restarted after the crash, with Hunt taking a dominant win, however celebrations were understandably muted on the podium. Having witnessed one too many drivers trapped in the fiery remains of their crashed cars, Formula One veteran Chris Amon refused to restart the race after the incident and retired from F1 racing that very day. The film's hospital scenes, where Niki undergoes burn treatment and is subjected to a lung vacuum, are particularly memorable and harrowing. In real life, Marlena instantly burst into tears upon seeing Niki's injuries, and was much more affected by the sight than is depicted in the film. There is truth that a priest gave Niki the last rites, however, an act that, in Niki's words, made him so upset that he put more effort into not dying.
Niki, hör auf. Bitte hör auf.
Marlene, ich weiß, was du denkst, aber bitte. So geht's nichts. Bitte.
The film expertly balances the graphic detail of Niki's injuries with the ongoing narrative of Hunt's on-track successes during Niki's absence, all witnessed by Niki on television during his treatment and recovery. Meanwhile, the immediate reaction to the crash at Ferrari was finding a replacement for Niki as soon as possible. This seemingly cold reaction was one that was all too common with the level of death that the sport had grown accustomed to. In 1957, upon learning of the fatal crash which claimed the life of Ferrari driver Eugenio Castellotti, Enzo Ferrari's infamous first question was, "Alla macchina, how's the car?" With Niki's prognosis still unclear, but expecting him to be out of the season, the Scuderia swiftly hired the Argentinian driver Carlos Reutemann from Brabham Martini. During Lauda's absence, James wasn't entirely unchallenged in his championship fight, however, with John Watson putting up some firm opposition in the lone Cosworth-powered Penske. Ferrari's decision to boycott the Austrian Grand Prix and therefore prevent two competitive Ferraris from being an obstacle to Hunt's title challenge proved to be a terrible lapse of judgment from the prancing horse, as the Englishman continued to close down the points gap to Lauda. Although not covered in the film, McLaren attempted to replace the M23D with a brand new car mid-season, the M26. Although it made several appearances at practice sessions throughout the year, it would only compete at the Dutch Grand Prix and, even then, was only fielded by McLaren second driver Jochen Mass. Hunt was not a fan of the M26 and it wasn't used regularly until 1977. Even then though, the M23, now on version E, would be used in the early rounds whilst issues with the M26 were resolved. The scene where James is seen beating a journalist for asking inappropriate questions about Niki's personal life post-accident is another fictional invention of the film. It does, however, make for a valuable scene to illustrate the camaraderie between the two drivers despite the intensity of their on-track battle. Lauda's decision to return to the grid at Monza, a mere 40 days after his near-fatal crash and against all medical advice, is undoubtedly one of the bravest actions in sporting history, as well as one of the strongest scenes of the film.
That race should never have gone ahead.
No, it shouldn't.
So in many ways I feel responsible for what happened, and
You were. But trust me, watching you win those races while I was fighting for my life, you were equally responsible for getting me back in the car.
Unfortunately, Rush is once again guilty of fictionalising this race, a race which would again prove to be incredibly controversial. At their national circuits, Ferrari seemingly exerted their influence once again, and on Sunday the octane values of McLaren and Penske were measured and found to be too high. Ferrari's fuel was 98.6 octane, whilst McLaren's was 101.6 and Penske 105.7. The McLaren and Penske qualifying times were therefore deleted, the McLarens being forced to start from the back row of the grid. The race result would be no better for Hunt. He would spin out and retire whilst battling Jose Carlos Pache in a desperate attempt to make it into the points. McLaren and their fuel supplier Texaco would later protest the validity of the race, but this would be to no avail. The slow-motion collision depicted in the film between Hans-Joachim Stuck and Mario Andretti did take place as they battled for 9th place. However, by the time of the crash, Niki had already overtaken Stuck. Overlooking the alleged political games going on behind the scenes, Monza 1976 will forever be remembered as a remarkable comeback. It certainly wins my vote for being the most heroic moment in Formula 1, as Niki drove to a remarkable 4th place, scoring 3 valuable points. The film then chooses to skip the American and Canadian rounds, both Hunt victories, and head straight to the season finale. With both drivers still in contention at the final race of the year, the Japanese Grand Prix at Fuji was all set to become a historic race. Not only would it see Hunt or Lauda crowned world champion, but it was also the first time Japan had hosted a Formula One Grand Prix. Once again, the teams battled off the racetrack during the build-up. Doing their best to off-balance Ferrari, the McLaren team arrived in Japan early in order to acclimatise to the time difference and do some practice laps, much to the chagrin of Ferrari's Daniele Aldetto. A particularly enjoyable trick that they played on the Scuderia saw the team fit fake grills to their cars to pretend that they were protecting the intakes and ducts from loose gravel, another rumour they'd spread to the press. McLaren knew that Niki would visit their garage and end up unsettling the Ferrari garage when he reported the fake McLaren developments back to his team. Indeed, when the cars were rolled into the pit road, Ferrari had copied McLaren and promptly had to remove all of their copied grills when they realised they'd been played. The 1976 Japanese Grand Prix was the first occasion that a live Formula One race was broadcast worldwide via satellite. This coverage certainly added to the pressure from the organisers to start the race in spite of the torrential rain on track and the drivers' opposition to having to compete in such poor conditions. In fact, James Hunt adamantly said that the conditions were totally unsuitable to race, even though it would cost him the World Championship. Alistair Caldwell, meanwhile, had his engineers fire up the engines on the McLarens to make sure the other teams did the same, and had them motivate the sodden Japanese crowd before using the crowd's cheers to convince the officials that, if they didn't start the race, there would be a riot. At 4 PM, with the light fading, the cars finally lined up to commence racing.
Grand Prix is underway!
Using flashbacks of his experiences so far, the film does a good job of illustrating Niki's reasons for pulling into the pits shortly after the race start and switching off his engine without the need for heavy exposition. Given the weather conditions, Hunt's point difference, and there being no guarantee that the McLaren would make it to the checkered flag, it certainly wasn't guaranteed that by choosing to retire his car, he was also surrendering the championship. It was a measure of the man that when Niki was told by his team to say that the engine was broken, he refused, owning the decision to retire from the race, and in so doing, making a huge statement prioritising driver safety at the very moment that F1 was broadcast live globally for the first time. The decision to retire from the race on safety grounds was not Niki's alone, but was also taken by Emerson Fittipaldi, Carlos Pache and Larry Perkins. Given the fight for the championship though, the film makes the right decision to focus solely on James and Niki's struggles at Fuji. Despite the appalling weather conditions as the race commenced, luck was on James's side that day, the rain easing and the track conditions vastly improving around 20 laps into the event. All was not plain sailing for the McLaren team, however. James ignored orders from the pit wall to run through puddles to cool his wet weather tyres, and consequently, despite slowing his pace, the McLaren's heavily worn front left tyre eventually deflated on lap 68 of 73. This led to a particularly slow pit stop where a McLaren mechanic had to physically lift the car by its suspension as they were unable to slide in the left front jack. At the time of the failure, Hunt had been cruising to make his worn tyres last in second, but he now rejoined the race in fifth, needing a fourth place finish to win the championship. Ahead of him lay Clay Regazzoni in the sister Ferrari and Alan Jones's Surtees. Although they do show James passing Clay Regazzoni's Ferrari on track, a critical pass in ensuring James's championship success, in reality Clay, disillusioned with the Scuderia, deliberately chose not to fight Hunt too aggressively for the position. The Swiss driver had found out that Enzo Ferrari was firing him just prior to the race, another of the many poor decisions taken by Ferrari that year that would help James Hunt and McLaren in their championship challenge.
He's alongside Clay Regazzoni. This could be the World Championship.
Once James had taken the checkered flag, the reactions from the McLaren garage were also much different in reality than those depicted in the movie. It wasn't an apologetic James that pulled into the pits, but a furious one. That is, until Teddy Mayer managed to calm him down and break the good news.
Let's get you out of there, buddy.
I'm sorry, Teddy. I'm sorry. I thought I could make up the
Sorry, what are you
ground.
talking about? You did it.
Did what?
You crazy bastard. You came third. You got the points. You're champion of the world. James Hunt is now officially confirmed as finishing third here in Japan. And that means he is champion of the world.
Despite the triumphant result, Alistair Caldwell refused to celebrate with James in that moment because of how unnecessarily difficult he had made the race for himself. And so the result of the 1976 Formula One World Drivers' Championship was sealed with a single solitary point standing between first and second place at the end of a titanic season. The reaction to Lauda's decision to retire from the race was divided in the Ferrari camp. Vilified in the race's aftermath by the Italian press as cowardly and scared to drive, back in Maranello, Enzo Ferrari was also furious with Lauda, feeling that he was now past his prime and should not have returned to compete after his accident, as that way the Scuderia could have saved face. Hiring Carlos Reutemann, the driver who had been drafted in to replace Niki in his absence as the number one driver, was a further spiteful action underlining Enzo's disappointment. Undeterred, Niki drove dominantly in 1977, securing the championship with 2 races in hand, and promptly quit the team to go to Brabham for 1978. Niki retired from F1 after 1979, but would eventually be lured back to the paddock by Ron Dennis, joining the McLaren team in 1982 and claiming a hard-fought third and final World Championship in 1984 against his teammate Alain Prost. Niki finally closed the book on his career as a Formula One driver at the end of 1985. Eventually, Niki reconciled with Enzo Ferrari, running into him by chance at Imola 6 years after he quit the Scuderia. Without being fed news of his team from executives, advisors and newspapers, Enzo embraced him like a long-lost son. James retired from F1 much sooner in 1978, after another year at McLaren and 7 rounds with Wolf Racing. In the days after his career as a driver, he would become even better known for his often brutally frank commentary opposite the legendary Murray Walker between 1979 and 1993. Tragically, James died of a heart attack in 1993 at the age of 45. In Niki's own words, James died too early, too young. Having seen Rush, Niki declared that he wished he'd been here to see the movie. It would have been the best. In his later life, Niki would return to Formula One, in 1993 taking a consulting role at Ferrari, and in 2001 becoming the team principal of Jaguar Formula One. In 2012, Niki was appointed non-executive chairman of the Mercedes-AMG Petronas Motorsport team, where he would become instrumental in the signing of Lewis Hamilton in 2013. Tragically, we lost Niki in 2019, but his memory lives on in motorsport. Since his death, every Mercedes Formula One car has carried a red star, symbolising Niki's iconic red cap which he would wear to race weekends. Since his passing, Rush's ending is now even more poignant, as the film's epilogue features real-world footage of James Hunt and Niki in his later life.
People always think of us as rivals, but he was among the very few I liked. And even fewer that I respected. He remains the only person I envied.
So, having spent a good amount of time pointing out many of Rush's flaws in comparison to the real-world events that it is depicting, why am I still giving this film a 10 out of 10? With all of the events that transpired during the 1976 Formula One season, it is almost impossible to include everything within a movie's runtime. What Rush does particularly well is showing that James and Niki were wildly different characters. James, the unrestrained playboy, a party animal with great natural talent behind the wheel of a car, and Niki, the calculating and reserved master. In many ways, it's a clash of two approaches as F1 was beginning to progress into a more technological age. Naturally, some of the season's events are omitted and much of the team politics is also put aside in order to focus upon the rivalry between the drivers. It is the depiction of that rivalry which is my biggest issue with the film, a criticism shared by James's son Freddie, who has very unflattering opinions of Chris Hemsworth's depiction of his father in particular. Despite this criticism, however, Rush does a phenomenal job of translating that epic season to the big screen. Die-hard F1 fans will immediately spot the film's minor inaccuracies and dramatic license taken with certain aspects of 1970s F1, but for me, those don't detract from the movie in the slightest. Motorsport dramas and documentaries are a big passion of mine, so it's difficult for me to be too critical of Rush. Excluding real-world footage of the 1976 season, such as that available from Duke Video's season review, it's rare to see a cinematic adaptation of 1970s Grand Prix racing. The closest thing we've seen is the brief racing sequences featured in Al Pacino's Bobby Deerfield, a film I was admittedly lured into watching by the promise of Grand Prix sequences, only to be disappointed upon finding that the bulk of the film was a tragedy-tinged romance. Although Rush 2 covers James and Niki's contrasting romantic fortunes, a trend adopted by most motorsport movies including Grand Prix, Le Mans and Le Mans 66, Rush successfully ensures that the sporting rivalry is always placed front and centre within the narrative. If you're a motorsport fan like me, it's a must-watch, but the drama of this true story, married to incredible cinematography and great acting, make this the sort of movie that should appeal to everybody. It means so much to me, in fact, that I even have a small selection of props from the film in my collection. Hopefully you enjoyed the 6th episode of Sitting Through the Credits. Apologies for the hiatus, this particular review has been a bit of a labour of love, and given my passion for motor racing, proved difficult for me to edit into a manageable length. I'm looking forward to bringing more film reviews to you in the near future. Thanks for listening.
I'm gonna hide this tape when I'm finished.
Replicants are like any other machine. They're either a benefit or a hazard.
Racing, it's life.
What's the boogeyman?
Any further resistance will be dealt with in the same way.
As a matter of fact, it was.
End of story.